morning sun hung low over the cracked asphalt of Liberty Range's parking lot, a dusty stretch just outside Boise, Idaho, where the air smelled faintly of sagebrush and gunpowder. At 68, John Jack Harlan eased himself out of his rusted Ford Bronco, the creak of the door echoing the ache in his joints. His left hand trembled slightly as he gripped the steering wheel, a faint reminder of the neurological condition that had shadowed him for 2 years. The doctors called it essential tremor, a cruel thief that stole the steadiness from hands that once dismantled threads in the jungles of Vietnam and the sands of Iraq. Jack didn't talk about those days anymore, not to his neighbors, not to the bartender at Rusty's Tavern, not even to himself. But today, something had stirred. Maybe it was the dream of Coronado's surf crashing against the shore, or the memory of men he'd led, now just names etched in stone. He adjusted his faded Boy State cap, reached for the battered duffel on the passenger seat, and stepped into the gravel. The glass doors of Liberty Range slid open with a mechanical and the sharp tang of gun oil hit Jack like a punch from the past. Inside, the place buzzed with the usual crowd, weekend warriors in tactical vests, a few cops off duty, and a cluster of college kids, probably here for Instagram clout. Behind the counter, 3 young employees in matching black polos lounged with the kind of arrogance only the young and untested could afford. The tallest, a wiry guy with a man bun and a vape pen dangling from his lips, barely looked up from his phone. "Morning, Pops," he drawled, eyes flicking over Jack's weathered jacket and trembling hands. "You lost or something?" Jack set his duffel on the counter, the canvas worn thin from decades of use. "Here to shoot," he said, his voice low, steady despite the tremor. The guy, his name tag read Tyler, snorted, exchanging a glance with his coworkers, a stocky kid named Ethan and a lanky one called Bryce. "First time, huh?" Tyler asked, smirking. "We got rentals if you need something simple." "Brought my own," Jack replied, unzipping the bag with deliberate care. His fingers fumbled slightly, the tremor betraying him as he pulled out a registration form. Ethan leaned over to Bryce, whispering just loud enough for Jack to hear, "Bet he's got arthritis or worse. Shouldn't be anywhere near a gun." Bryce stifled a laugh, pretending to check the ammo display. Jack's face remained impassive, his hazel eyes fixed on the form as he scrawled his name in uneven script. Once, his handwriting had been sharp enough to forge orders under fire. Now it was a battle just to keep the pen steady. "Lane 6 is open," Tyler said, sliding a pair of ear protectors and safety glasses toward Jack. "Try not to shoot the floor, all right, Grandpa," Ethan chuckled, loud enough to draw a few glances from the range's other patrons. Jack nodded, gathered his gear, and moved toward the lane, his gait slow but purposeful, compensating for a knee that hadn't been right since a bad drop in Kandahar. The range was alive with a sharp crack of gunfire and the low murmur of conversation. In Lane 7, a group of 4 guys in their late 20s, decked out in brand-new tactical gear, were taking turns with a shiny AR-15. The loudest of them, a broad-shouldered dude with a buzz cut and a Punisher skull tattoo peeking out from his sleeve, noticed Jack immediately. "Yo, check it out," he said, nudging his buddy, a skinny guy with a GoPro strapped to his chest. "Gramps thinks he's Rambo." The group snickered, their voices carrying over the range's hum. "Bet he brought a musket," the skinny one named Cody muttered, pulling out his phone to start recording. Jack ignored them, setting his duffel on the Lane 6 table with the same calm he'd once used to disarm tripwires. From the bag, he withdrew a leather case, its edges softened by years of handling. Inside was a Colt 1911, its blued steel polished to a mirror shine, a relic from an era when weapons were built to last a lifetime. The group in Lane 7 didn't miss a beat. "Holy shit, look at that the buzz-cut guy," his friends called him Derek, said, loud enough for the whole range to hear. "Gonna rattle the walls with that dinosaur, old man." Jack loaded the magazine with slow, methodical precision, each round clicking into place like a prayer. The tremor in his hands fought him, but he moved with the focus of a man who'd faced worse than mockery. If he heard Derek's taunts, he gave no sign, his face a mask of concentration. The 1911 felt heavy, familiar, a trusted ally from nights when the only sound was the thump of rotor blades and the screams of the wounded. He inserted the magazine, the click sharp and final, but his fingers slipped slightly as he racked the slide. The trimmer won that round, and the slide caught halfway. "Careful, Grandpa," Derek called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Don't shoot your damn foot off." The group erupted in laughter, Cody's phone still rolling, capturing every moment for their group chat or maybe TikTok. Hashtag senior citizen special, Cody muttered, zooming in. A few other shooters glanced over, some amused, others uncomfortable. In lane 5, a woman in her early 20s wearing a West Point hoodie shot a disapproving look at Derek's crew but said nothing. Beside her, a man in his 30s, lean and sharp-eyed, watched Jack with a different kind of attention. His name was Captain Ryan Kessler, an Army Ranger recruiter in civilian clothes. And something about Jack's posture tugged at a memory he couldn't quite place. Jack adjusted his ear protectors, scratched and worn from ranges and places most of these kids would never see, and slipped on his safety glasses. His hand shook visibly as he raised the 1911, aligning the sights with the target 25 yards downrange. Derek leaned over to Cody, not bothering to lower his voice. $10 says he doesn't even hit the paper. Cody grinned, still filming. Make it 20 if he clips the ceiling. The Ranger's noise seemed to fade as Jack closed his eyes for a split second, drawing a slow breath. He exhaled halfway and something shifted. His stance adjusted, subtle but deliberate, like a predator settling into position. The tremor in his hands didn't vanish, but it seemed to sync with some deeper rhythm, a cadence forged in decades of discipline. Muscle memory, older than the men mocking him, took over. His finger found the trigger, and in a heartbeat, 5 shots rang out. Crisp, controlled, each one a thunderclap of precision. The range fell silent, the echo of the last shot lingering like a judgment. Jack lowered the 1911, his hands resuming their faint tremble, and pressed the button to retrieve the target. The paper slid forward, revealing 5 holes punched clean through the bullseye, clustered so tightly they could have been covered by a quarter. Derek's jaw dropped, his buddies frozen, mid-laugh. Cody's phone dipped, the red recording light still blinking but forgotten. In lane 5, Captain Kessler removed his ear protection and his eyes locked on the target. The woman beside him whispered, "Holy shit," under her breath. Tyler, the range employee, stepped forward, his earlier smirk gone. That's some shooting," he stammered, glancing at the target like it was a relic from another world. Derek's crew exchanged uneasy looks, their bravado evaporating. "Lucky shot," Cody muttered, but his voice lacked conviction, and he quickly shoved his phone into his pocket as if hiding the evidence of his misjudgment. Jack began to reload, his movements slow but unhurried, as if the silence around him was just another day at the office. He didn't look at Derek, didn't acknowledge the stunned faces, but his voice cut through the quiet like a blade. "Luck's what you call it when you don't understand skill," he said, not raising his eyes from the magazine. "Want to try your luck at 600 yards crosswind with a spotter calling corrections?" The challenge hung in the air unanswered. Derek's face reddened, his Punisher tattoo suddenly looking more like a costume than a badge. The range, moments ago a chorus of jeers, now felt like a church after a sermon no one expected. Captain Kessler stepped forward, his expression intense, almost reverent. "Sir," he said, his voice steady but carrying weight, "are you Colonel Harlan?" "John Harlan, 1st Special Forces Group." Jack paused, his hands stilling on the 1911. He turned to Kessler, studying him for a long moment before giving a single nod. "Was," he said simply. Kessler's posture stiffened and he snapped to attention, offering a salute that felt out of place in the civilian range but carried the weight of respect earned in blood. "Sir, I trained under your field manual at Fort Bragg. Your tactics are still required reading for every Green Beret sniper." The words landed like a grenade, silencing the last whispers of mockery. Derek's crew shifted uncomfortably, Cody's hands fumbling to delete the video he'd been so eager to post. Tyler and his coworkers stood straighter, their casual arrogance replaced by something closer to awe. In that moment, Jack Harlan wasn't just an old man with shaky hands. He was a legend, standing quietly among them, his presence rewriting the room's narrative in 5 perfect shots. The air in Liberty Range hung thick with the scent of cordite and the weight of revelation. The echo of Jack Harlan's 5 perfect shots still seemed to reverberate off the concrete walls, each bullet hole in the target a silent rebuke to the jeers that had filled the room moments ago. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting stark shadows across the faces of the stunned onlookers. Derek and his crew in Lane 7 stood frozen, their tactical gear now looking like props in a play they hadn't rehearsed for. Cody's phone, still clutched in his hand, was no longer recording, its screen dark as if ashamed of its earlier purpose. Tyler, the range employee with the man bun, stood behind the counter, his vape pen forgotten, his mouth slightly agape as he processed Captain Ryan Kessler's words. Colonel John Harlan, 1st Special Forces Group. The name carried a weight that pressed down on the room, turning casual shooters into silent witnesses of history. Jack Harlan, his hands resuming their faint tremble, methodically ejected the magazine from his Colt 1911, the metallic click sounding louder in the hush. His weathered face remained impassive, but his hazel eyes held a flicker of something, memory perhaps, or the ghosts of battles fought in places these kids would only see in movies. He didn't look at the crowd, didn't bask in their sudden awe. He simply began to reload, each movement deliberate, as if the act of preparing the weapon was a ritual to keep those ghosts at bay. Captain Kessler, still standing at attention, lowered his salute but kept his gaze fixed on Jack. "Sir," he said, his voice steady but laced with reverence, "your field manual saved my team in Helmand Province. The way you taught us to adjust for windage under fire, it's why I'm standing here today." His words were a bridge between past and present, connecting the old man in the faded Boise state cap to a legacy etched in the blood and sweat of soldiers who'd survived because of him. The woman in the West Point hoodie beside Kessler, Cadet Emily Carter, wiped a tear from her cheek, her earlier indignation at Derek's crew now replaced by quiet admiration. The revelation rippled through the range like a shockwave. In Lane 7, Derek's broad shoulders slumped, the Punisher tattoo on his arm suddenly seeming childish. Cody, his skinny frame tense, shoved his phone into his pocket, muttering, "Shit, man, we didn't know." His buddy, a guy named Jake with a backwards cap, elbowed him to shut up, but the damage was done. The group's earlier bravado had evaporated, leaving only the sting of their own ignorance. Tyler, Ethan, and Bryce behind the counter exchanged glances, their casual arrogance replaced by a mix of shame and curiosity. Tyler stepped forward, clearing his throat. Colonel Harlan, sir," he said, the title awkward on his tongue. "That target you just shot, it's incredible. We'd love to frame it for the wall, maybe put your name on it. And your range times on us today, no charge." Jack paused, his fingers stilling on the magazine. He looked up at Tyler, his expression unreadable. "Keep your money," he said quietly, his voice carrying the gravel of a life spent shouting orders over gunfire. "And I don't need my name on your wall. The only targets that matter are the ones that kept my men alive." The words landed like a gut punch, their simplicity cutting through the room's lingering tension. Tyler blinked, nodded, and stepped back, his face flushed with the realization that he'd misjudged the man before him. From Lane 7, Derek took a hesitant step forward, his boots scuffing the floor. He rubbed the back of his neck, avoiding Jack's gaze. "Sir," he said, his voice low, almost inaudible, "I'm sorry. What I said, it was out of line. We didn't know who you were." His friends nodded, their eyes fixed on the floor, the weight of their earlier mockery pressing down like a physical force. Cody, the one who'd been filming, swallowed hard. "I deleted the video, sir," he added, his voice cracking. "It was stupid. I'm sorry." Jack studied them for a long moment, his eyes sharp despite the years etched into his face. The tremor in his hand seemed to fade as he set the 1911 down, as if the act of forgiveness required the same focus as his shooting. "Disrespect isn't about what you say," he said evenly, his words measured but piercing. "It's about what you assume. You assumed I was less because of my age, my hands. Assumptions get people killed." The truth in his voice was raw, unfiltered, a lesson forged in firefights and funerals. Derek nodded, his face pale, and stepped back, his friends following like chastened children. Captain Kessler, still standing nearby, broke the silence. "Colonel, I'm here recruiting for the Ranger training program this week. Your techniques, your manual are still the backbone of our sniper training. I know it's a lot to ask, but if you'd consider speaking to our candidates." He trailed off, his tone hopeful but respectful, as if he knew he was asking a legend to step back into a world he'd left behind. Jack's gaze drifted to the target, the 5 holes staring back like eyes from his past. He thought of the men he'd trained, their faces young and eager, some now gone, others carrying his lessons into battles he'd never see. He thought of the tremor that betrayed him, the mornings when his hands refused to obey, the nights when he woke to the sound of mortars that weren't there. And yet, standing here, surrounded by the echoes of his own precision, he felt something stir. A spark of purpose he thought had died with his youth. "I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice soft but firm. "But they don't need my stories. They need to learn how to breathe through the chaos." Kessler nodded, a faint smile breaking through his military composure. "Yes, sir. But hearing it from you, someone who's lived it, would mean everything." The range manager, a burly man named Mike, who'd been watching from the sidelines, approached cautiously. "Colonel Harlan," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I served in the 82nd Airborne, sir. Your name came up in every sniper course I took. We had no idea you were you. If you ever want to come back, this range is yours. No questions, no fees." His eyes glistened, and he blinked rapidly, trying to maintain his composure. Jack shook his head, a faint smile touching the corner of his mouth, the first sign of warmth he'd shown all morning. "I don't need special treatment," he said, "just a lane and a target." But as he spoke, his voice caught, just for a moment, and those closest to him saw the flicker of pain in his eyes. Not pain from the tremor or the limp in his knee, but something deeper, a grief for the brothers he'd lost, for the pieces of himself left behind in jungles and deserts, for the weight of a legacy he'd never sought. Emily, the West Point cadet, stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly as if to steady herself. "Sir," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "my brother was a ranger. He made it home from Syria because of what you taught. He told me your name before I ever read it in a manual. I need you to know that..." Her eyes brimmed with tears and she looked away, embarrassed but resolute. Jack's expression softened, and for a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. He reached out, his trembling hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Your brother," he said quietly. "He's the honor, not me." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken sacrifices. And Emily's tears fell freely now, her shoulders shaking as she nodded. The range was no longer just a place for weekend shooters. It had become a sanctuary of sorts. A place where the past and present collided, where a man with trembling hands reminded everyone what true strength looked like. Derek and his crew stood silently, their earlier laughter replaced by a humbling awareness. Cody, still clutching his phone, looked like he wanted to disappear. Tyler, Ethan, and Bryce busied themselves with paperwork, their earlier smirks replaced by a quiet respect. Jack picked up his 1911, sliding it back into its leather case with the care of a father tucking in a child. The crowd watched, some with awe, others with a newfound reverence, as he zipped his duffel and turned toward the door. But before he could take a step, Mike, the range manager, spoke again, his voice breaking. "Sir, just one thing. That target," he gestured to the paper with its perfect grouping still hanging in lane 6. "It belongs on our wall, not for you, but for us, to remind us what real looks like." Jack paused, his hand on the duffel strap. He looked at the target, then at the faces around him, young, old, military, civilian, all waiting for his response. "Frame it if you want," he said finally, "but don't put my name on it. Put 'for the fallen' instead. That's who it's for." His words hit like a wave, and Mike nodded, his throat tight, unable to speak. As Jack walked toward the exit, the shooters parted, their weapons set aside, their postures straighter, as if standing in the presence of something sacred. Derek and his crew joined them, their heads bowed slightly, their earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet shame. Captain Kessler followed Jack to the door, his voice low but urgent. "Sir, about the training program. I meant what I said. Those candidates need you. Saturday, 700, Fort Boise. Will you be there? Jack stopped, his hand on the glass door, the morning sun casting his shadow long and lean across the floor. He thought of the trimmer, the bad days when his hands felt like traitors, the weight of a life spent pulling triggers for reasons bigger than himself. And then he thought of the kids, like Emily's brother, the ones still out there, fighting battles he'd never see. Saturday, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll bring my own targets. The door slid shut behind him, and the range fell silent, save for the faint hum, comical, heartfelt apology. The weight of Jack Harlan's legacy lingered in the air, a reminder that some heroes don't fade, they reload, and they carry the torch for those who never made it home. The Idaho dawn broke cold and sharp over the Fort Boise training grounds, a sprawling expanse of dirt and steel where the next generation of Army Rangers honed their craft. At precisely 6:45, Jack Harlan's battered Ford Bronco rolled into the visitor lot, its tires crunching gravel like the crackle of distant gunfire. The tremor in his hands was worse today, a relentless quiver that made even gripping the steering wheel a battle. He sat for a moment staring at the faded trident pin on his Boise State cap, its edges worn from years of salt and sun. At 68, Jack had seen more war than most men could imagine. But today wasn't about him. It was about the kids waiting beyond the security gate, their eyes hungry for guidance, their futures hanging on the edge of a trigger pull. He'd made a promise to Captain Ryan Kessler, and in a life defined by keeping his word, Jack Harlan wasn't about to start breaking it now. He stepped out into the chill, his breath fogging in the air, and adjusted the duffel slung over his shoulder. The weight of the Colt 1911 inside felt like an anchor, grounding him against the memories that surged with every step. Nights in Vietnam's jungles, the deserts of Iraq, the faces of men who trusted him to bring them home. His knee ached from an old shrapnel wound, but he moved with purpose, each step a defiance of the body that betrayed him. At the checkpoint, Kessler waited, his ranger uniform crisp, his salute sharp, as he spotted Jack. "Morning, Colonel Harlan," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that cut through the morning frost. "We're honored you're here, sir." Jack waved off the formality, his voice gruff but kind. "Save the salutes, Captain. I'm retired, just here to shoot." Kessler's eyes crinkled with a smile, but he didn't argue. He handed Jack a visitor badge, and together they walked toward the training range, where 28 Ranger candidates stood in formation, their PT gear identical, their faces a mix of nerves and determination. They were young, barely older than Jack's grandson, and their eyes followed him with a curiosity that bordered on reverence, thanks to Kessler's briefing the night before. "At ease," Jack said as he approached, his voice low but commanding, cutting through the morning's quiet. The candidates relaxed, but only slightly, their attention locked on the man whose name was legend in their manuals. Jack set his duffel on a metal table, the trimmer in his hands glaringly obvious as he unzipped it. He pulled out the 1911, its polished steel catching the dawn's light, and a small leather case of precision tools. The candidates formed a semicircle around the range, their breath visible in the cold. "I'm not here to talk," Jack began, his voice steady despite the shake in his fingers. "You've had enough speeches. Combat doesn't care about words. It cares about what you do when the world's fallen apart." He held up the 1911, its weight familiar despite the years. "This isn't about the gun. It's about the man behind it. You adapt, you breathe, you pulled the trigger. Anything less, and you're not coming home." The candidates listened in silence, their eyes fixed on Jack as he field stripped the 1911 with deliberate care. His hands shook, the trimmer making each movement a struggle, but his precision was surgical, every action a testament to decades of mastery. "You'll face worse than shaky hands out there," he said, reassembling the weapon with a slowness that commanded absolute attention. It'd rain, fear, the guy next to you bleeding out. You don't fight the chaos, you work with it, find its rhythm, time your shot. His words were sparse, but they hit like bullets, each one sinking deep into the candidates' minds. For 2 hours, Jack moved among them, his presence quiet but electric. He corrected a grip here, adjusted a stance there, his instructions minimal but profound. "Don't rush the trigger," he told a lanky kid, struggling with his aim. "You owe calm to the man on your left." To another, fighting a flinch with each shot, he said, "Fear's just noise. Breathe through it." The tremor in his hands vanished when he demonstrated, his shots ringing out with devastating accuracy, each one a reminder of the man who'd rewritten sniper doctrine. The candidates watched, their skepticism melting into awe. Even the cockiest among them, a broad-shouldered Texan named Luke, stood taller, his shots tightening as Jack's words sank in. One candidate, a wiry young man named Ethan with eyes that carried too much for his 22 years, approached Jack during a break. "Sir," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "how do you do it? Keep steady when it's real? My brother, he didn't make it back from Kandahar. I need to know." The question hung in the air, raw and heavy, and the other candidates fell silent, their own fears reflected in Ethan's words. Jack's gaze softened, and for a moment the weight of his own losses flickered across his face. Friends buried, missions that haunted his dreams, the tremor that reminded him daily of his own mortality. "You do it one breath at a time," Jack said, his voice low but unwavering. "You carry the weight of the ones who didn't make it, but you don't let it pull you under. Every shot you take, you're shooting for them." Ethan nodded, his eyes glistening, and stepped back, gripping his rifle tighter as if it could anchor him against the grief. The other candidates watched, some wiping their eyes, others standing straighter, as if Jack's words had lit a fire in their souls. Back at Liberty Range, the story of Jack's visit had spread like wildfire. By Tuesday morning, a small bronze plaque had been installed beside Lane 6, its inscription simple but profound, "For the Fallen." No name, no title, just as Jack had requested. The range manager, Mike, had insisted on it, his voice thick with emotion as he hammered the plaque into place. "It's not about him," Mike told the staff, his eyes distant. "It's about what he stands for." Every Tuesday at 900 Lane 6 remained empty, not by rule but by unspoken agreement, a silent tribute to the man who'd turned a dusty range into hallowed ground. Shooters who'd been there that day spoke of Jack in hushed tones, their stories growing into legend. How an old man with shaky hands had outshot them all, how his presence had changed the air itself. Jack's name echoed beyond the range, carried by Kessler to the Ranger training cadre. Instructors began referencing Harlan's cadence when teaching breath control under stress, a nod to the rhythm Jack had described, finding calm in chaos, timing the shot to the heartbeat of survival. Candidates who'd trained under him that Saturday carried his lessons like a talisman, their shots straighter, their resolve stronger. One, a quiet kid named Sarah, wrote to her parents about meeting the colonel, her letters stained with tears as she described how his words had given her the courage to face her fears. But Jack himself sought no spotlight. He returned to his small Boise apartment, where the walls held no medals, no photos, just a single framed letter from a soldier he'd trained decades ago, thanking him for the skills that brought him home. The tremor grew worse in the days that followed, the bad days outnumbering the good. Yet each morning he rose, brewed his coffee, and stared out at the mountains, wondering if he'd done enough, if the kids he'd trained would carry the torch when his hands could no longer hold it. On a quiet evening as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack received a call from Kessler. "Sir," the captain said, his voice urgent, "we've got a situation. One of our candidates, Ethan, the kid who asked about his brother, he's struggling. He's got the skill, but he's freezing under pressure. We're running a night exercise tomorrow, high stakes, live fire. He needs you, sir. Not a manual, not a lecture." The line crackled, and Jack's hand tightened on the phone, the tremor making it slip slightly. He thought of Ethan's eyes, the weight of loss they carried, the same weight Jack had borne for decades. He thought of the range, the plaque, the kids who looked to him, not as a hero, but as a guide through their own darkness. "Tomorrow," Jack said, his voice steady despite the shake in his hand. "What time?" Kessler exhaled, relief evident. 1900, sir. Fort Boise. We'll set up a lane just for you." Jack hung up, his gaze drifting to the 1911 on his table, its steel gleaming in the lamplight. The tremor was bad tonight. Worse than it had been in years, but he felt the spark again. That fire that had driven him through jungles and deserts, through loss and survival. Tomorrow he'd face the range again, not for glory, but for Ethan, for the fallen, for the ones who still had battles to fight. As he lay in bed, the night pressing in, Jack's mind wandered to a memory, a firefight in Fallujah, the air thick with smoke, his hands steady as he took a shot that saved 3 men. He wondered if he could still be that man, if one more trigger pull could light the way for a kid like Ethan. The answer hung in the dark, unresolved, as the clock ticked toward tomorrow's crucible, where an old warrior would stand once more, his legacy teetering on the edge of a single, trembling shot.